In the pre-episode, we explored various intellectual battles, such as how the American troops managed to expose the tunnel entrances and how the Vietnamese army set mines at these entrances to trap American soldiers. We also looked at how the Americans neutralized the mines at the tunnel entrances set by the Viet Cong. How could the US troops go down into these tunnels, and how deadly were the traps designed by the Vietnamese troops? In this episode, let's continue to explore the traps set up by the Vietnamese forces and how the Americans managed to counter them. That day, the Viet Cong even came up with another weapon with extremely high damage in the tunnels, that was the bow and arrow trap. They built according to a very simple principle, that is just not paying attention, crawling lightly, touching the rope under the path. It activates the bow, letting the arrow free to fly. The cellar was only enough for one person to stoop to fit, so the arrow had dived and it could not miss. These types of traps are one of the ones that work best and most effectively, but sometimes it is also the thing that stifles the Vietnamese troops, because many times the Americans are afraid to go in to clean the bodies of their comrades. So the Viet Cong had to pull that corpse to the ground for them because it got stuck on the road below, but at some point it disintegrated. The smell was extremely unpleasant. The second suffering is that the traps are made to trap the US soldiers, but sometimes it traps the Viet Cong too. The Vietnamese soldiers also tried to mark the place to place the traps to avoid the accident, but the tunnel was dark, not to mention that when they were driven by the American, they had to run in a hurry, not paying attention, so they got involved. That day, the Vietnamese and the US often had pet exchanges with each other. America uses dogs to sniff the tunnels like in episode 01, so Vietnamese use snakes to increase the difficulty of the tunnel rat soldiers. Whenever they evacuate, they will leave some poisonous snakes. The snakes are locked in the cage. When the tunnel rat soldiers come in and touch the rope lightly, the cage door opens like automatic technology. The snakes began to rush into the American soldiers. The tunnel rat soldiers were just crawling suddenly to touch something slippery. The brothers above determined to get down and pull up. That tactic proved quite effective at first, but then after that, the Americans also had a way to counter it. Before crawling down, they let the weasels go ahead to detect snakes. That is why the Vietnamese method of using snakes is no longer effective. The tactic of using snakes has been removed, only the traps and arrows are still in effect. So the question is why the Vietnamese soldiers do not fight from afar, but just have to trap each other with the Americans in the cellar, to make themselves miserable. The answer is yes, the Vietnamese troops have a lot better set of traps than we thought. To talk about the types of traps, maybe I have to make a separate episode so that you can better understand the intelligence of the Vietnamese army. Particularly in Chu Chi, at that day people devised many types of traps to trap troops on the ground, but the most classic are traps to trap people from above. Especially the helicopter. This is one thing that makes the Americans admire it, because they have not met any nasty and unusual traps like the one of Vietnam that day. The Viet Cong found out that American planes wanted to fight Chu Chi and had to find an open place for a surprise attack. The Vietnamese soldiers take helicopters down by setting mines in places where they can land. The question is that there are dozens of different landing zones, so shouldn't they have to trap all those dozen? Where did they get so many mines? The answer is no. The Vietnamese troops have to make the Americans fight by their way. Other landing zones, they will plant all kinds of trees, so that helicopters cannot land there. The only option is the landing zone where they have pre-installed mines. The helicopter kept landing, the wind blowing, whatever was the impact on the detonator, so the mines were activated, it exploded. Later, the American soldiers got smarter too. They played the way of letting the army swing the ropes to the ground to avoid the wind of the helicopter pulling its detonators. But then the Viet Cong also came up with a way to make them drop the army that is also dead. That day they left a mine on the ground, then used a wire to detonate a propeller. Hang that propeller on top of a tree branch. When the helicopter is hovering over, the wind from the helicopter will blow the propeller, so the mine is activated. Again, all the American soldiers died. The squad of helicopters carrying troops came to fight them upside down, naturally seeing less. Chu Chi tunnels have become a brand name, but every American soldier, when they heard the news of being moved, they would feel trembling. Thanks to those talents of Chu Chi people, the whole world must learn from them, especially countries in the Middle East. Until now, Americans have always been obsessed with the underground war with Vietnam. That is why they are forced to restore the tunnel rat force. In October 2018, The U.S. Department of Defense shared that the weakness of the U.S. Armed Forces was the lack of reliable technology to conduct military operations in urban, high-rise buildings, dense and underground infrastructure. The organization has held competitions called Underground Challenges, so that participants can unleash the creation of remote-controlled robots to find everything in the underground tunnels. The more objects your robot can find and provide the correct coordinates for, that team will be the winner. However, when in a deep tunnel, reinforced concrete, or thick rocky soil, the robot and the controller still do not exchange information with each other. It is for that reason that the US continues to have to restore the tunnel rat army. To better understand Chi, you should probably go there once in your life. You will experience feelings that you never get in other places, such as tunneling tunnels, seeing the tunnels with your own eyes, eating cassava tubers in the style of the people there in wartime, seeing Huang Cam's kitchen, and being allowed to shoot real guns. It's a place you should really go once in your life. Through the story of Chi, we can see the creativity, as well as the persistent will of the Vietnamese people when the land is invaded. In the previous episodes, we delved into the ways the US military employed in navigating the Chi tunnels and how the Viet Cong countered the American tactics. The strategies of the US troops, like using Big Chi Germany to detect tunnels, pumping tear gas into the tunnels to force the Vietnamese soldiers out, flooding the Chi tunnels with water from the Saigon River, using B-52 plane to bomb the tunnels, or US F-5 aircraft to drop bombs, all ended in gruesome failure. Even deploying a mighty force for sweeping operations or bombing in various ways proved futile. The US military even brought in massive bulldozers to clear the tunnels, using heavy tanks to crush the tunnels during Operation Cedar Falls. So why did Operation Cedar Falls still end in failure? How did the Viet Cong manage to thwart those colossal bulldozers and advanced tanks? Let's explore in this video now. In those days in Chi, there was Mr. Hoai Duc, a man whose knowledge only reached reading and writing, with some mechanical skills related to cars, but without any education in bomb making. Yet, he was the one who ingeniously crafted the Gat mines that trapped tanks, making the American military shed tears in their battles against the Vietnamese forces in Chi. Initially, he borrowed 2 mines from the military officials, Russian mines, to study and then used them to test on US tanks. However, these mines required direct pressure to explode. Placing a bomb between the tank's wheels had no effect at all. This drove him to experiment further, leading him to extract explosive material from bullets and unexploded bombs to create these mines. He added a firing mechanism, leaving a small hole for a long stick. When a tank rolled over the stick, it triggered a powerful explosion without needing direct pressure. According to statistics, due to Mr. Hoai Duc's innovation, nearly 5,000 American tanks were destroyed in Chi. Most were taken down by his handmade mines. This astonishing feat drew numerous foreign journalists after the war to interview Mr. Duc out of sheer curiosity and unbelievable. For them, a highly educated person with ample credentials couldn't achieve what he did. So, how could a rural youth with basic literacy outwit and improve combat weaponry so effectively? An Australian war correspondent named Burchett, who was stationed in Vietnam, sought an interview with Mr. Duc. He asked, given the unknown danger, how could you take such risks? Mr. Duc replied that soldiers on the battlefield face death whether from a tiny bullet or a big bomb. The value of death is the same, size doesn't matter in this case. Hearing Mr. Duc's response, Burchett, the journalist, was deeply surprised, nodding in admiration. To the Vietnamese, figures like Mr. Duc were not hard to comprehend. But for Americans and Westerns, it was unfathomable. Vietnamese people had limited access to modern weapons due to lack of education and resources. Just looking still has no chance, let alone inventing ways to combat sophisticated weaponry. According to former Vietnamese Prime Minister Vo Van Kiet, a high-ranking leader in the Chi battlefield, the Vietnamese soldiers saw American M113 armored vehicles swimming across the river, a sight as strange as encountering an alien species. At first, they heard distant rumblings that echoed like thunder beneath the ground. Then, unfamiliar vehicles appeared, moving in a line. The Vietnamese soldiers didn't recognize these vehicles. They gathered by the river, pointing and discussing, trying to figure out what kind of vehicles these were. Initially, they thought the tanks on the opposite bank couldn't cross the river, so they stood at the riverside, joking for fun. However, the tanks plunged into the river, crossing to their side. The Vietnamese soldiers were stunned and rushed back into the tunnels to hide. Later, they learned that those were M113 armored vehicles, capable of both swimming and shooting. Initially, the Vietnamese forces were wary of these armored vehicles as they were versatile and unpredictable. Able to cross water, move on land, and fire weapons and even transported soldiers. But after devising the Gat mine strategy, the Vietnamese military started to wish for these vehicles to come to Chu Chi in abundance for economic gain. The overseas Chinese community knows that the Viet Cong has successfully beaten M113, flocked to Chu Chi to order parts and materials in bulk, like scrap metal collectors do today. Components, machinery, even aluminum casings, each piece could be sold for about $100 to $150 in 1967. This influx of funds enabled them to buy rice, salt, and medicine, supporting a company of about 100 soldiers for a whole week. As the supplies almost dwindled, the Vietnamese soldiers would sit by the river, eagerly awaiting the armored vehicles because if this kind of vehicle came they had scrap to sell making money. If not, they had nothing to eat. Although the US Army failed in tricks with the most advanced techniques, it lost a lot of money. However, the purpose of the US was still to clean up the Vietnamese guerrilla army in the Chu Chi tunnels. So the US military did not want to stop at this defeat. So how did the US military change its tactics? What weapons or fighting methods can be used to clear the guerrilla army hiding in the tunnels? And how the Vietnamese army against the US Army? Let's find out in the next episode.
How do you think about this topic? Let us know in the comments below. Don't forget to like and share this video. Subscribe and turn on notifications so you don't miss our videos and much more. Click on the screen to watch another thrilling video. Thank you for joining us. See you in the next one. Take care.